We know that President Nelson has invited every member of the church to make and keep sacred covenants with God. He has indicated to us that by making covenants and keeping them, that we will have the opportunity to gain and obtain every spiritual blessing available to every man, woman, and child everywhere who makes that covenant and keeps that covenant. So the full spiritual blessings of the gospel are available to us as we make and keep covenants. I've reflected on the importance of getting onto the covenant path and staying on the covenant path. And I've often thought about how important that is. And it strikes me that President Nelson was very much inspired to teach this doctrine, to make this invitation, because we do live in a day and age when covenants and contracts and promises don't seem to have the same meaning and resonance as they did in times past, potentially. Oftentimes in the past, not always of course, but oftentimes people were judged by how they kept their word. Did they keep their promises? Did they do what they said they were going to do? Were they trustworthy? And not just about keeping agreements they'd signed on paper, legal contracts and other things, but in terms of their word, their trustworthiness. Did they do what they said they were going to do? Were they reliable and dependable? And there's a great character element to being a promise maker and a promise keeper, especially in the context of relationships. As husbands and wives, for example, it's very important that we make and keep those promises, particularly to our spouses, in the context of the marriage covenant or the marriage contract. At a deeper level, we could say that God himself is a promise keeper. He's a covenant maker. He enters into those covenants, and he takes that very seriously, that he feels that he is obligated to make and keep those covenants. He doesn't derail those covenants. He doesn't excuse himself and say, well, I don't have to keep that promise that I made to bless my children. He holds himself responsible and accountable. He's a covenant maker. He's a promise keeper. And so this idea that the very nature of God himself is that he makes and keeps promises. He's reliable. He's dependable. He's trustworthy. He doesn't promise something and then forget about it or ignore it or backtrack or change the promises that he's made, in the sense of he keeps his word. He does what he said he's going to do. And I think that's so critically important. And I love the fact that President Nelson has given us these key invitations to get on the covenant path, to stay on the covenant path, or to come back to the covenant path, and to remain true and faithful to the promises and the covenants we've made. These covenants do matter, and they are a shield and a protection to us against temptation, against difficulty, against being derailed, against our own moods and our own fragile nature, where sometimes as human beings we may not want to be true and faithful to those things we've promised, which are hard, things which are difficult when we're not feeling well or not feeling motivated, especially so. But it's particularly important that we are true and faithful to our word then. So it strikes me that making and keeping covenants is part of developing the divine nature. It's part of putting on the character of Christ. He went to fulfill the atonement in the Garden of Gethsemane and on the cross in Calvary. He fulfilled that atonement, even though it was difficult, even though it was really painful to do so. And it would have been quite easy to change his mind and say, I don't want to do this. But the covenant character that he had built allowed him to persist. And so I feel that it's so important to remember that we make and keep those covenants. We will have shortcomings and failings, but we can repent. We can change, we can do better, we can be better. And I really believe that President Nelson was correct. The spiritual blessings are dependent on making and keeping covenants. The fullness of blessings only comes to us as we devote and promise ourselves to God, as we abide in his covenant, as we do those things which are right and true and proper within the bounds of that relational connection that we have with God. How wonderful that we can be blessed by covenant, protected and upheld and strengthened and kept safe by the power of those covenants with God.